Dr. Peter Attia is a medical doctor that's taken the social media landscape by storm over the last few years. And additionally, he's released a book called Outlive on how to successfully live the longest, healthiest life possible. Well, recently he was asked to cover what he considers the hierarchy of longevity according to how much impact they actually have. And he puts out 4, plus an additional one that he mentions at the end that he considers possibly the most important. And it's true, it really is. So let's hear what he has to say on his 4 to 5 rules or categories, and then we'll fill in some of the details.
I don't know that I would formulate it that way, right? I might say, look, category 1 are sort of the essential behavioral things that you have no choice but to engage in, whether you want to or not, right? So you have to eat, you have to sleep, you have to move. You just have a choice in, do you want to do those things correctly or not correctly? Or do you want to do those things in a manner that promotes health or erodes health? Right? So again, there's nobody listening to us who doesn't eat. But again, you can choose how much you eat and what you eat and when you eat. There's nobody who's alive who isn't moving, because locomotion is life and the absence of life is the absence of locomotion. But you can certainly choose to move very little. You can choose to move a lot, and you can choose to decide on how you move. You alluded to it already, right? You can move in a certain way that puts your aerobic system in a zone that maximizes fat oxidation. We call that zone 2. You can move at a level where you consume incredible amounts of oxygen at your maximum aerobic level. You can choose to move in a manner that uses resistance and gravity against you and all those sorts of things. Similarly, we all have to sleep, right? Matt Walker would probably tell us the number of days you could go without sleep before you would literally perish. But again, you have a lot of choices in how you do it. So anyway, I agree. That's kind of category 1, but that's kind of the way I would frame it.
Category or rule 1 is to nail down, let's call them the necessities, or in the Jungle Book, they'd be called the
bare necessities, the simple bare necessities. Forget about your worries and your strife.
I guess since we aren't blue, we'll just stick to the basics. Dr. Attia is talking about 3 primary factors: your nutrition, your physical activity, and your sleep. If we were to create a pyramid of importance, this necessities section is the base, by far the most important. And if you aren't focusing 80 to 90% of your attention on this piece, you probably shouldn't move on to hear the other section, because they'll have negligible impact compared to the base. Now, these 3 necessities, nutrition, physical activity, and sleep, can be further broken up into the amount of consumption, what you're consuming, and the timing of consumption for nutrition. Then amount of physical activity and type of exercise for physical activity. Finally, amount and quality of sleep as well. Okay, but let's assume that you've done all that, or for some reason it isn't completely feasible. What's section 2 of the pyramid?
I would put in category 2 sort of what are the molecules that you would exogenously take to try to impact any of those systems. And maybe, and again, I'm not saying my framework is correct and yours isn't. I'm just saying this is the way I think about it. I would then say, what are the molecules that I could take that specifically target disease processes? So I kind of think of, like, if we want to live longer, and I described this, I think, in chapter 4 of Outlive, that turns out to be mathematically equivalent in the modern society to delaying the onset of chronic disease. Now, that wasn't true 100 years ago. 100 years ago, if you wanted to live longer, a few things had to be true. You couldn't die during childbirth, and because that was a huge hit on mortality. And then you had to not get an infection or succumb to trauma. And then maybe 150 years ago, that was the case. But today, most of those things are taken care of by antibiotics, sanitation, and the modern miracle of childbirth in this era. So now, for you and I to live longer, we basically have to delay the onset of cardiovascular disease, cerebrovascular disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease, dementing diseases, and metabolic diseases. We have to delay the onset of those things. The longer we delay the onset, the longer we will live, full stop. So you can use everything that you talked about in the first category plays into that. But you also have this other category of where you can take molecules that specifically target those things. You can take metformin or an SGLT2 inhibitor or a GLP-1 agonist, and you will directly impact those things. You could take a PCSK9 inhibitor or a statin or bempedoic acid. You will directly impact those disease processes. You will delay the onset of those diseases, and you will reduce the mortality associated with them.
Real quick, isn't it miraculous that we've largely moved from one phase of medicine to another? Dr. Attia briefly mentions it, but it's incredible that we've been able to crush infection, crush birth-related death, and crush trauma-related death. Of course, it isn't completely eliminated, but compared to the past, it's been annihilated by modern medicine. What a massive achievement by humanity. I'm so proud of us. Anyway, back to the points at hand. Let's call this section of our pyramid the direct intervention section. It's definitely smaller than the necessities, but it can play a pretty meaningful impact. That's especially true if a person has an outsized risk. So, for example, metformin has a direct effect on diabetes in people with diabetes, an outsized risk of death, allowing them to live longer and better than if they didn't take metformin. However, is it as powerful as, exercise or nutrition? No, because those necessities are all encompassing. And a drug is usually designed to specifically target one major problem in a disease state, but it usually can't address all of the factors of the disease. For example, metformin lowers blood sugar levels, reducing the glycation across the body, thereby reducing the burden of molecules like advanced glycation end products that are directly tied to worse disease. However, it may not be as much of an impact on the insulin resistance signaling within the cells. To be fair, it does have some impact, but it's limited. Or it might not address the chronic inflammation that may come with type 2 diabetes or kidney problems. All of that is addressed potently by exercise and nutrition. So direct impact, yes, but not as powerful as the bare necessities. Now, we're going to get into some niche rules, but ones that most people are most excited about, especially the biohacker community.
Then I'm going to go to a third category that says, are there exogenous molecules that you can take that don't target a disease per se specifically, but we're going to put them in a category called Geroprotective, which is they target hallmarks and pathways of aging that you've described. So we talk about all of these things that occur in an aging phenotype where we see more inflammation, we see a greater abundance of senescent cells, we see reduced nutrient sensing capacity of mTOR, which you describe as probably the most important nutrient sensing system in our body. So we have, these somewhere between 9 and 14, the number just keeps changing arbitrarily, but it doesn't really matter. We have these central things that everybody would agree define what an aging phenotype is. And can we use exogenous molecules to target those specifically? You gave one example, which I would argue is the single best example, which is rapamycin. So rapamycin targets a very specific hallmark of aging, and we can talk about what the experimental evidence is to suggest that that makes you live longer. So I would sort of say those are the big three categories. And then basically the fourth category you could just say is like, how do you put them all together and how aggressive do you want to be in culminating them?
The third and fourth group is a large part of what I cover on Physionic because people seem to be extremely interested in that extra boost beyond the first two pieces of the pyramid. Let's call this third one the indirect interventions, mainly because they tend to help more peripheral areas of health. For example, they might reduce inflammatory markers and might reduce insulin, but the effect tends to be milder. Some of these molecules are certainly speculative and others have better evidence behind them. They may not even necessarily combat a particular disease, but they help the overall health profile of a person. The one that comes to mind is creatine. It's not a necessity to consume it, but supplementation has hundreds of studies in its favor as a fantastic addition to one's health, impacting the musculature and the brain, along with other tissues. This should be one of the lowest areas of emphasis, but it can still play a role. Dr. Attia also briefly mentions a fourth, which is how to implement these three pieces optimally, or as optimally as we can. And I think this is of least importance. Timing and protocoling ourselves to death is significantly less important than just doing it at any point, in any way, during the day. You know, those people that post videos about how they get up at 5 a.m., do a 1-minute gratitude journal, do a 25-minute yoga session, meditate for 12 minutes, give thanks to their chi, and stare into the sun for exactly 6.3 minutes as it rises over the horizon before downing 27 supplements and heading to the gym. Yeah, that stuff. For the most part, with few exceptions, is of least importance. As Nike says it, or Shia LaBeouf, just do it.
Just do it!
But there's one more, and this one isn't a piece of the pyramid, but more so the protective shield around the pyramid, the glue of the whole thing. Rule 5.
Another area that I want to talk about that we won't talk about today, which is like, how does all that factor into kind of emotional health and happiness and well-being, where, you know, none of this other stuff matters if you're kind of unhappy. And so you have to, and you've done so many podcasts on that topic, right? You've had Paul Conti on, where you kind of go through the understanding of ourselves and our minds, and why that's also a very important part of it, because it actually does impact how long you live. Because if that piece isn't working, it's very difficult to regulate the first bucket.
This is massively overlooked in the health world, except by mental health professionals. But if your mental well-being is not the best, then it is extremely difficult to maintain any of the other rules or sections of the pyramid for extended periods of time. It'll devolve into eventually stopping all of the health habits or the inability to even begin in the first place. That can't be understated. I don't discuss it much because it isn't an area of intense research for me, but I do have a degree in psychology, and it does resonate with me incredibly well. I'm glad that Dr. Attia brought it up, and like I said, it is the glue that allows the pyramid to stay upright. Otherwise, it will just break apart. I know I said that 80 to 90% of your effort should be on rule 1, the necessities, but that is with a huge asterisk. Only if rule 5, well-being, is sufficiently fortified can you then focus on the foundational piece at the bottom of the pyramid. This is an excellent way to look at health and longevity. If you're interested in more on the topic, consider this video right here. I'll see you over there.